Morgen, meine Damen und Herren, and my apologies for doing this in English. Herr Grenke, thank you for your comments this morning. Why don't we begin just by agreeing that trade is good? Why don't we just agree the market is good in certain contexts, surrounded in certain ways, and then we have Mother behind us. We don't have to spend hours discussing this. It's fine, it's good. Let me also say that I think Germany is a great industrial trading nation. It's a fantastic success story. I'm an enormous admirer. I'm saying this because I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm about to say. I'm a deep, long-term supporter of the EU, even though I think that the flaws in its founding, overly technocratic, utilitarian, linear, and, well, technocratic and economically led, the undersides of that weakness, it was a strength in the beginning, are really beginning to show because of the lack of citizen involvement. You can only go so far with the top-down structure. And today, the real weakness in Europe is the fact that there is almost no involvement by citizens in a direct way. There's very little movement of citizens except Germans going on holiday in the south of France or Italy or whatever. The citizens are not moved within the structure of Europe as they are within Germany or France or Spain or whatever. So, having said these things, you know, if we're going to talk about trade, then we need to talk about it in the context of what is the context of trade? What do we really think about trade? Where do we think trade is going? Fine, do the deal with the United States. You just did a deal, Europe just did a deal with Canada. We're doing endless deals, fine. But there are some real questions about whether doing these deals actually delivers what we think or thought 40 years ago they were going to deliver. They deliver certain things, but do they actually deliver what 40 years ago and 30 years ago and 20 years ago the economics community and the technocratic community said they would deliver? And the answer is, when we look at growth patterns and so on, the answer is no, they don't. And that's why you were quite right to raise the question of agriculture and data, because there are some very serious questions on the table, which do not mean that we're in the midst of an argument between are you for free trade or are you a protectionist, as was said last night. It's complete nonsense. We're not living in a Manichaean world in which there are only two choices. Are you a free trader for the market, or are you a protectionist and old-fashioned nationalist? This kind of argument is being put forward increasingly by the leaders, not you, sir, you gave a very interesting statement, actually, by our leaders who are nervous about how badly things are going, and they keep saying, no, if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not with us, you're a protectionist, or you're an anti-globalist, or you're an anti-marketist. There are actually about 20 other possibilities in between globalism as presented and protectionism or whatever on the other side. So, for example, if the flow of trade means that there are ever more cheaper goods driving prices down below the costs required by a middle class, lower middle class society, then what is that? Is that trade or is that dumping? And one has to say that the greatest failure of the WTO and EU and NAFTA, etc., is its incapacity, their incapacity, to deal with the difference between trade and dumping. Why? Because it's been far too simplistically done, and it simply believes the more trade there is, the better. And we have a few rules, but those rules are not covering what undermines solidly built middle-class societies. Germany has done better than most, but you know, sitting here last night and hearing you this morning, you are so much an exception to the rule. Good for you. But it isn't like that in India. It isn't like that in North America. It isn't like that in Latin America. It isn't like that in France, Spain, Britain, and so on. So I'm thrilled that Germany is still hanging in as a middle-class society. But don't mistake your story, even though it's getting more difficult, for what's happening elsewhere. Perhaps when you ask the question about trade and trade deals, maybe the real situation today is that we actually have a surplus in goods in the world. And that because we have a surplus in goods, it's actually driving prices down. And that is the real explanation for what is in effect dumping. and that therefore the increase in the amount of trade will not produce growth or wealth. It will in fact do the opposite, because it will increase the surplus in goods. Now, that's a reason for Germany to keep a certain idea of its middle-class model, because otherwise you will be caught in the same spiral that, for example, the United States is caught in, and other parts of the world are caught in. So I think that we need a much more sophisticated, a much more integrated, a much less ideological, which globalization has been very ideological, approach towards economics. So note the Manichaean idea of it's a battle between free trade and the market versus protectionism and the people and government on the other hand. Let me just add a detail, because it was said 3 times, I think, last night, that people who trade together don't fight. This is, excuse me for being rude, but I only have 20 minutes. This is garbage. This is not true. There is no historic example of this being true. People who trade together go to war. The First World War took place between the people who were primary and secondary traders of each other. In fact, if you're going to make that argument, you can make the counter argument, which is the more people trade together, the more they become jealous of each other, which leads to war. So I wouldn't make the argument either way. I would say that trade and war don't work the way it has been described over the last 40 years. The other detail is that there is a real problem with what's happened in the departments of economics, and therefore in public policy and economics, which is there used to be a very important role played by economic historians who had an idea of the nature of the world and of the past and its relationship to the present. They've been pushed increasingly out of universities. We've had an increasing reliance on macro and micro economists who are, the macro are becoming more like the micro all the time, more and more obsessed by what they call facts. Whereas, you know, facts today are like pebbles on a beach. There are billions of them. You can choose the ones that suit you. And we're dealing with a situation where facts are pulled out daily, confusing the public, confusing the political leaders. This is the way to go, sir. Here are the facts. And losing that sort of sense of context and of direction. For example, context and direction. Does trade stop war? No. So let's just stop talking about that and talk about other things. So in a way, we're in an era, this globalist era has led to a rise in utilitarianism and a linear approach, and an increasingly utilitarian and linear elite. Again, sir, I thought you gave a non-utilitarian introduction, so thank you for that. But this utilitarianism has led to an increasing limitation in the public debate over the role of economics and its relationship to society. It's almost as if the utilitarian forces being in charge are desperate to limit the public imagination to their level, which is a utilitarian level, which is well below the creative levels that, for example, produced the Industrial Revolution, that produced the enormous recovery of Germany after the last war. That wasn't done through utilitarianism. That was done through imagination and creativity. And that is what is being forgotten today. So there are lots of numbers showing reduction in poverty, but you really have to sit back and look at how those numbers are done, and look at what that's converted into, what that actually looks like on the ground. I'm on the ground around the world all the time. I'm not a big expert on it, but I'm on the ground. The definition of the increasing disappearance of poverty, according to statistics, is extremely dubious. And in fact, on the other hand, we're seeing a reintroduction of new kinds of poverty, hidden poverty, institutionalized poverty. Families that used to be in the West, for example, one-job families are now 4-job families. Maybe not in Germany, but in increasing parts of Europe, all through the rest of the world. Increasingly, 4-job families without any security. This is a new kind of what you might call institutionalized hidden poverty, coming along with the reintroduction of an 18th and 19th century class system, which I will come back to in a second. So the total reality of where we're standing today is there have been some really great things to come out of the globalist ideological movement, as always with ideologies, even though it was based on essentially not a new globalist idea, but on a mid-19th century English idea, 2 mid-19th century English ideas, very that the revolutionary movement of the late 20th century was actually just a heating up, a half-baked heating up of 1850s English Midlands ideas. Hardly revolutionary, hardly new, hardly something which is appropriate to new technology and to a surplus economy. So it was also based on a very peculiar thought, which was that you would promote economics from its normal historical position of number 2 or 3 in the way you run a society, putting it in charge. And the problems we're having today, the problems you're having in Europe dealing with the crisis in Europe, is that you've put utilitarian economics in charge, and because it doesn't have an ethical base, it's now introducing old-fashioned Judeo-Christian morality into its use of economics. Well, these people have sinned. They've gone into debt. We must make them suffer. I mean, just analyze. And in this sense, I don't admire what Germany is doing. There, I think Germany's been very much part of the problem, not part of the solution in the last couple of years. So, this idea of putting economics in the lead is not working in the long term and will not work. Things were promised 40 years ago. You go back and look, things were promised about growth. Instead, we've had a 40-year crisis in growth. We're supposed to do away with nationalism and all the ugly things of the old nation states. We've actually seen in the last decade a return of negative nationalism, a new norm of autocracy. Oh, it's okay. There's economic growth in those countries, even though there's an autocracy. The return, really frightening return of populism around the world, including Europe, North America, and the rest of the world. Racism returned about 10 years ago as a mainstream public discourse. I can actually track it day by day, the return of racism in public discourse. Russia actually has put in place legally, I'm just giving tiny examples, religious defamation. We all spent years fighting in Geneva so that Pakistan and company would not institutionalize internationally religious defamation. Russia just did it. Russia just did it. Religious defamation. This is one of enormous blow against freedom of expression and democracy. In India, they're about to elect Modi. I don't think, if you know India at all, that I have to say much more, except it will be a terrible backward step. And one of the causes of Modi's election, if he's elected, is, in fact, the adoption of the globalist industrial model of agriculture, which has been a disaster in India, you know, the suicides, the poverty. The only part of India where agriculture is successful is one state where they turned their back on the globalist model and used a rethought model of the cooperative system for the dairy industry. And it is an enormous success. They're exporting precisely because they ignored the models of the market as put forward in the globalist theory. Democracy is weakening everywhere in the world. The idea that democracy's been strengthened under globalism. There was a little pop, and it's been going down since the late 90s with increasing dangers everywhere, including in the West, including in Europe and North America, with less and less interest by the public, dropping voter levels everywhere with a few exceptions. In effect, bin Laden came along just in time to save Western leaders from the failure of globalism, and allowed them to change the principal public discussion from one of the glories of economic leadership to one of fear, and the fear of security and what was going to happen if we didn't put security in front of economics. But it was done without any announcement that they hadn't delivered on what was promised in the 70s and 80s, even though they had lots of statistics to suggest they did. Just a few details. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the leading growth area internationally was armaments, a pure inflationary area not counted into the way we count inflation. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, probably the leading growth area was the inflation in the financial paper market, if you like, the idea that finance could replace industry. Again, Germany's done better than most on this front, but there is nevertheless the infection of the explosion in the role of the financial sector, which is unrelated to production or growth, explosion in takeovers, in mergers, which have nothing to do with production or growth, which have to do with financial playing, astonishing multiplications in the number of, in the amount of paper versus goods. So I've forgotten the numbers now, but if you sort of go back 25, 30 years, it's 15 times, you know, paper versus goods, and then it's 25 times, and then it's 50 times. We don't even know what it is today because the utilitarian economists are so embarrassed that they're quite careful not to count, not to keep track, or they don't know how to do it. So this is a kind of uncounted inflation, which is trying to deal with the crisis in growth, which globalization was supposed to deal with and has not dealt with. Globalization promised increased competition. Instead, we've actually seen an increasing concentration in ownership. We've seen the return of oligopolies and monopolies, something that we did not think was possible. I thought I would no longer have to know how to spell oligopoly. And suddenly it's back in a major way, direct result of the globalist methodology. I can tell you that freedom of expression on a day-by-day basis in the West and around the world is challenged. There's a crisis a day. It's worse and worse and worse, directly related to the breakdown of the ability of ethically based systems to protect freedom of expression when faced by things like concentration of ownership and fear of the security system. So I would argue, this is the only controversial thing I'm saying. Everything I've said so far is perfectly normal. You're just not used to hearing it, right? Is that actually the globalist period, which was supposed to be the glory of the market and the return of capitalism, actually has seen the reversion to the pre-capitalist period, and we've fallen back into mercantilism. This is a mercantilist period of the pre-late 18th century type, in which these large corporations are in effect like the British East India Company or the Hudson's Bay Company. And that is a fascinating thing because that is also, that's why the mergers and so on were so important, that is also a way of getting away from the problem of growth and the problem of not being able to succeed with real wealth creation that would stabilize middle-class societies. As a result, you've seen an explosion in the managerial class. One of the biggest outcomes of globalization has been the gigantic explosion of the managerial class. Because the production side doesn't really work. We've seen a gradual slippage from the accepted model that what we needed was a diamond-shaped society with as many people as possible in the middle, to the old pyramidal-shaped society where most people are at the bottom. Of course, you can try to get this big pyramid up off the ground, and this is the hidden poverty, where you're getting poor people slightly up off the ground, but as soon as there's a crisis, they come crashing back down again. That's the rich-poor phenomenon of moving back to the pyramidal model. So let me finish by saying that it is not surprising. You made a quick mention to the question of the surveillance, but the surveillance is tied to the rise of secrecy. The rise of secrecy is tied to the rise of the managerial class. The managerial class is tied to the failure of growth and the failure of the marketplace in globalization. So that, for example, in 1989 in the United States, they're very honest about their counting. They're the only honest country when it comes to counting statistics about what the state does. And I'm not American, I'm Canadian. We rarely say nice things. In 1989, they were producing 6.8 million new secrets per year. And I made a big joke of this in a book called Vulture's Bastards in 1993. And today, what could they be? 6.8 million new secrets. And of course, that means Germany per capita is exactly the same. I mean, you're no better. Canadians are no better on this front. Today, the United States produces 55 million new secrets per year. 55 million. And that is marked by the rise of secrecy in the corporatist private sector, the mercantilist private sector, an explosion again in a bureaucracy which runs the world of secrets. Snowden is a perfectly natural outcome of the fact that you've had this incredible inflation in the number of people just running the secrets. So of course you're going to have leaks at the end of the day because there's such a growth of the opaqueness of our states. So, final comment. You could tell there was a problem when the response of Europe to 55% youth unemployment in Spain was virtual indifference. And, in fact, the elites could only think about punishment and saving the banks as opposed to saving the people. So you have 500 people a day being thrown out of their apartments and houses in Spain, and the only thing the leaders of Europe, the technocratic leaders of Europe, could think about was, how do we save the banks and how do we punish the people, if they were even thought about. I had, and that's where that morality, that introduction of morality into economics shows up. Oh, they're in debt, they can't pay their debts, we must punish them. And so I had a conversation about several weeks ago with two of the state bankers, heads of state banks. One, a very famous European head of state bank, the other, a very famous North American. I will not name them. And we talked about this crisis that's going on in the West, in Europe in particular. And they were sort of looking quite indifferent. They just had a public conversation where they never mentioned the word citizen, poverty. They just talked about it as if it was an abstraction with no people in the economy. And at the end, I said, well, you know, there's a real problem here. I mean, there's 55%, and it's probably worse, not better, than it appears, because there's the hidden poverty question. And one of them looked at me and said, oh, it's all cyclical. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. Periodically, you have the right line. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's all cyclical. The First World War was cyclical. The Second World War was cyclical. It's all cyclical. And then they looked at me and walked away. Because it's not cyclical. It's failure. It's actually leadership failure and systems failure and a failure of cynicism and a lack of imagination. So what we have today is a very isolated elite, isolated from the realities of the population, unable to use its imagination to talk about what's really happening. And I think we have a desperate, desperate need to find ways to reintroduce the grassroots, the citizens, into the public place, into the political process, to get away from the corporatist, almost Mussolinian methodology which is being used to run Western democracies, you know, interest groups, top down, to get away from that, to find a way to get the brilliance and the legitimacy of the citizens back in, and in that process to admit, as a very interesting professor said to me last night, quoting Wittgenstein, that it's not about solutions, it's about dissolving the problems, not solving the problems. In other words, it's about admitting complexity. And if you can admit complexity, then you can actually admit to yourself when you're failing, and then you can say, how is it that for 30 years we've been trying to come to an international agreement on global warming, and we've got nowhere? In fact, we've gone backwards. Why is that? It's because we're taking a non-imaginative, linear, utilitarian, false counting and fact-based approach, as opposed to saying, this is an important moment. We know how to deal with important moments. They involve radical changes in direction. Globalism does not seem to be capable of allowing us to take radical social changes in direction. Thank you very much.